On November 3, 1874, in the snow-shed dark above Cisco, California, a railroad widow named Lu Yanhua, 7 months heavy, and worth to the men moving her exactly the $90 her husband still owed, was handed over to settle the debt. The company held the paper, the sheriff held the law, and the store held every sack of rice between her and the pass. Everyone in the camp assumed she would be sold on down the grade before the first heavy snow. What a miner did instead, with a borrowed pen and one blank line, would be repeated there long after the sheds burned. The sheds ran for miles along the mountain's shoulder, timber tunnels built to keep the drifts off the rails, and inside them the air stayed brown with pitch smoke even at noon. The accounting was done at a plank table under a hanging lamp, 3 company men and a clerk with a ruled book, and they discussed her the way men discuss weather at somebody else's harvest. $90, a cook's hands, 7 months along, which they counted against her. She stood with her bundle against her hip and let them believe she understood nothing. She understood most of it. 11 months in the camps had taught her the words that mattered: debt, paper, storehouse, no. What she held back was the rest: that her husband's name had been Chen Deming, that the payroll wrote him down as number 412, that when the shed timbers came down in March, the company sent up one man with a shovel and sent no letter anywhere. She had asked twice for his body. Twice she was told the mountain keeps what it takes. In her sleeve she carried the only thing she had brought over the water that was worth nothing to anyone else: her father's name seal, pear wood gone dark at the corners, the characters cut deep enough to still bite red into paper. In Sanshui he had pressed it onto ledgers, letters, and at the end onto her passage. It held the shape of her family in 4 strokes. Nobody in the sheds could read it. The miner had come down off the ridge with snow still melting on his shoulders and had not spoken through any of the accounting. He smelled of powder smoke and wet wool, and his knuckles were split in the way of men who worked rock in cold weather. When the clerk dipped his pen and asked what to put her down as, the man stayed quiet a long moment, looking at her rather than at the book, and the lamp swung on its hook, and nobody in that shed breathed. She had crossed 9,000 miles to be written into somebody's ledger. No one had yet asked her what to write. Then the man asked her. He asked badly. He put 2 fingers flat against his own coat, over the sternum, and said, "Halloran." Then he turned the same 2 fingers toward the air beside her shoulder, not at her face, which would have been a thing done to a dog, and waited, the way a man waits at a doorway he has opened for someone else to walk through. "Chun Sao Lin," she said. She said it the way her father had taught her to say it to customers who came into the shop in Sunwee with their sleeves rolled and their wrists out for reading. Family name first, because a person belongs to her people before she belongs to herself. She said it slowly, because in 11 weeks of ship and steam and wagon, nobody had needed it, and her own mouth had gone unfamiliar to her. The clerk wrote, "June Solon." She saw it upside down and crooked across the page, and something in her, which had been folded very small since Hong Kong, opened out. She reached across the ledger and took the pen out of the clerk's fingers. He let it go from pure astonishment. The nib was cheap and split, and the ink in the well had thickened with cold, but her hand remembered the discipline of a shop sign and 100 prescriptions copied out under her father's eye, and she wrote her name in the margin in characters. 3 of them, upright, the strokes coming down clean, the last one closing like a shut gate. Beneath it she added 4 more characters, smaller, and set the pen back in the well. "That can't go in a county book," the clerk said. "That's not writing, that's chicken scratch." "It's her name," Halloran said. "Put it down twice, yours and hers." Nobody asked her what the 4 small characters said. She did not offer. They were for her father, who had died owing money to men who had come to the shop with a ledger of their own, and they were not for this shed. The clerk copied the shapes badly, the way a man copies a fence he has never built, and then he brought his pen to the next column, and his confidence came back to him with the printed word. Occupation. He looked at Halloran, and he did not look at her at all. Wife? There was a paper on the counter that had come up from the store with her, folded in thirds, soft at the creases from travel, a broker's hand in San Francisco, and a red thumbprint at the bottom that was hers, pressed there in a room where a woman with gold pins had told her it was only for the passage. $340, transfer of contract, Parties Dry Goods, Red Dog, Nevada County. 6 men stood in the doorway of that shed with snow melting off their hat brims, and every one of them knew what the word wife meant when a paper like that came with it. Two of them had already put money down on how long she would last in the camp before she went down the hill to the cribs at You Bet. No, Halloran said. The clerk's pen hung. Hired, Halloran said. Write hired. Wages $10 the month and her board. Write the $340 against it. Write that when the sum's worked, the paper's dead and she goes where she likes. That's near 3 years. Then write 3 years. The clerk took up a pencil stub to figure it in the margin. He was still figuring when she said, in careful English, the two numbers she had counted out to herself while the men breathed and the lamp swung. 30. 4. She held up 3 fingers, then 4. 34 months. In her father's shop, she had reckoned 20 customers' accounts a day on a frame of beads, and after the beads were sold, she had gone on reckoning without them, the way a person keeps walking after the road ends. The shed went quiet in a different key than before. Then a man in the doorway laughed because there was nothing else to do with it, and the clerk wrote what he had been told and blotted it and turned the register so the lamp fell on the wet ink. Under. Nativity. He had put China. Under. Remarks. He had put see contract. And beside that, in a hand that shamed the page, her 3 characters leaned like a fence in a wind. Outside, the snow had stopped and the cold had come down hard behind it. Halloran took her bundle off the counter before she could reach it, felt the weight of it, and gave it back to her without comment, which she understood better than anything he had said all evening. It weighed almost nothing. A quilted jacket, a packet of needles, dried tangerine peel, and a knot of licorice root gone dark with age. A folded square of oiled cloth, and inside the cloth a small steelyard balance, ivory beam with its dotted measures inked in black, brass pan no wider than a teacup, silk cord for lifting, the last thing out of the shop that the creditors had not thought worth taking, because they had seen a toy. His claim lay a mile up the ditch trail, and the mule knew the way better than the lantern showed it. Water ran somewhere below them all the length of the walk, the company's ditch water, cold and busy, carrying itself down to the nozzles that were tearing the hillside open by day. She could smell the hill even in the dark. Cut clay, blasted rock, wet pine. The cabin was 1 room, tight built, sod on the roof and a stove that drew well. 2 bunks. On the second one a coat was folded square at the foot, and a pair of boots stood against the wall, toes out, in a size that was not his. He said nothing about them. He filled the kettle from a bucket and set it on, and then he coughed. A deep, wet, bottom-of-the-lung cough that went on too long and ended in a sound like cloth tearing. He turned his face to the wall for it, out of manners. She listened the way her father had taught her to listen. Cold damp lodged low. 3 weeks of it, maybe 5. When the water boiled, she asked for the cup with her hand, and he gave it, and she put in tangerine peel and a shaving of licorice, and let it stand while the color came up. He drank it without asking what was in it, which she also understood. He was asleep in his clothes when she saw the lantern. It was coming up the ditch trail slow, the way light moves when men are carrying something and minding their footing. 3 of them, and the one in front had a flat shape under his arm, square-cornered, wrapped against the snow. The register. She knew the book by its corners. She had stood in front of it 11 days before, down at Michigan Bluff, in a room that smelled of cold stove iron and other people's paper, with Nam wrapped inside her coat and the snow melting off her shoulders in slow dark rings on the floorboards. The clerk had dipped his pen and written the date and the hour and the sex of the child. He had written the word, male. He had written the mother's name in a hand that turned her family name into something she did not recognize, and when she put her finger on the next line, the ruled space with the printed word, father. Under it, he had set the pen down in the tray and folded his hands and told her the law did not provide for that entry in a case such as hers. She had asked what a case such as hers was. He had turned the book toward the window, as though the light might explain it for him, and left the line white. Now the line was coming up the ditch trail in the snow, under a man's arm, wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, and it was after 9 o'clock at night in the 2nd week of December. She did not wake Amos. She banked the fire so the light would be low and steady, moved the kettle onto the flat stone where it would keep without boiling, and took Nam out of the crate she had lined with flour sacking and put him high against her shoulder, where he made his small, wet breathing sound and did not stir. She set her feet where the floor did not speak. Through the gap in the shutter she counted them again. 3. Deputy Hoyt with the lantern, walking like a man who wished he were in bed. The clerk, Purnell, in a town overcoat that had never once been up a mountain. And behind them, unhurried, the one who had brought the others, Ansel Clerk, who signed for the Blue Canyon Water and Mining Company, and who had come to this cabin twice in the autumn to talk about the claim, and both times had spoken about her to Amos, in front of her, as though she were a stove. They knocked. The knock was almost polite. She opened the door the width of her body and stood in it with her son against her collarbone and the cold coming in over her bare ankles. "Evening," Hoyt said. "He in?" "He is sleeping," she said. Her English came out the way she had been building it all winter, one plank at a time, level and slow. "He has fever 4 days. I will speak." Purnell was already unwrapping the oilcloth, and the register came out of it the way a fish comes out of a barrel, heavy and dull and smelling of glue. He held it against his chest and looked past her at the table, and she understood that he wanted the table, and she understood exactly why, and she did not move. "There's a paper wants your mark," he said. "Nothing to be afraid of. It corrects the entry." "Corrects." "Completes it." He said it kindly. That was the part she would remember. "The line is blank. A blank line is untidy. This states the father is unknown to you. You make your mark, I enter it, and the record is closed and no one troubles you about it again." Behind him, Clerk looked at the roof of the cabin, at the flume trestle above it, at the snow lying in the ditch like a white rope running down the mountain, and said nothing at all, because he did not need to. She had learned in 3 years on Gold Mountain that the men who wanted the most spoke the least. If the child had no father in the book, then the man in the bed behind her had no son. If he had no son, then when the fever finished what the blasting powder had started in his chest, the claim and the water right and the little crooked cabin over the ditch would go back to the county and out again the next morning into the hands of whoever had already filed the papers for it. Her hand found the shape in her apron pocket without asking her. Boxwood, the length of her thumb, worn smooth at the waist where 40 years of her father's fingers had polished it, and cut on the base with the family name he had given her and the 2 characters he had chosen when she was 3 days old. Her father had recorded births for half the district of Sun Wee with that seal. He had recorded her brothers, and her cousins, and the twins in the house behind the ancestral hall, in a book of his own. In ink he ground himself, and he had never in his life left a line white because a man was inconvenient. "Bring the paper inside," she said. "The ink will freeze." They came in, the 3 of them, filling a room built for 2, and the lantern threw their shadows up the wall and bent them along the roof poles. Purnell set the register on the table and opened it and turned the leaves until he found the 11th of December, and there it was, her son, 1 line in a column of strangers, and the white space beside him. Then the bed ropes creaked, and Amos said, from the dark, in a voice cracked wide open by 4 days of fever, "Give me the pen." Clerk did not turn around. "You can put your name in that book," he said pleasantly, "and I will have you before a judge in Auburn for swearing false, and her before the same judge after." For a moment nothing in the cabin moved but the child, who turned his face against her collarbone and worked his mouth in his sleep. She understood the threat better than Clerk knew. She had sat on the plank bench at the back of the courtroom in Auburn in September, when the Kwang Chung store's clerk tried to swear out a complaint against the 2 men who had cut his queue with sheep shears, and she had watched the judge lift one finger and stop his mouth in the middle of a sentence, because a man like him could not be heard against a man like them. Her word had no weight in that room. It had less than the weight of the ink Clerk was letting dry. If Amos wrote his name in the register and Clerk carried it down the grade to Auburn and called it false swearing, there would be no one in the world permitted to stand up and say that she had labored 2 nights on this floor, on straw and a folded canvas, with Mrs. Delaney's hands on her knees and Amos outside in the snow, because the old woman would not let him in. "Amos," she said, "lie down." The bed ropes creaked again, longer. She heard the sound of him gathering himself the way a man gathers a load he already knows the weight of. Then his feet on the boards, one and then the other, and the blanket dragged off the bed with him, and hanging from his shoulder like a bad coat. 4 days of fever had taken the flesh out of his face and left the bones showing. She had brought him through it with panelia and ginger and the last of her father's ephedra, boiling it down in the small pot while the baby screamed in the crate beside the stove, and the steam had wet the walls until the pitch ran, and he had not once asked her what was in the cup. He had only drunk it and said, thickly, each time, that it tasted like the smell of a barn on fire, and drunk it again the next hour. He stopped at the table. The lamp put his shadow up across the ceiling boards. "Give me the pen," he said. Craig sat back. He was a small, neat man who pinned his cuffs with wire to keep them out of the ink, and he had come up on the mail sled from Gold Run with the register wrapped in oilcloth, and he had eaten 2 of her buns at the door without looking at her while he ate them. "I have told you the law," he said. "The column wants a father. The law wants a marriage. You have neither, and there is no clerk in this state will give you the second one, so there is no honest way to fill the first." "Then give me the pen and I will be dishonest." "You are ill," Craig said. "You will be sorry Thursday." Amos put out his hand, palm up, and held it there. It shook. He did not take the pen. He waited for it to be given, and the waiting went on long enough that she heard the stove tick and the snow start against the window in small dry handfuls, the first of it, 3 weeks early, the kind of snow that meant the sheds above Cisco would be full of men by Christmas. At last, Craig made a sound through his nose and laid the pen across the offered palm, the way a man pays a debt he intends to collect twice. Amos sat down heavily in the clerk's own chair. He turned the book toward himself with 2 fingers. He looked at the ruled page a long time, at the column of strangers above her son, a Delaney, 2 bunkers, a Ferris child dead the same day it was written down, and at the wide blank beside the last name on the page. Then he said, without lifting his head, "Say your name for me." She had not been asked in 19 months. Craig had asked nothing. Craig had written, "Jane." In the mother's column in a fine sloped hand, the way the store wrote it on her flower account, the way the men on the flume called her when they wanted more tea. "Lung yuet ha," she said. Slower. "Lung," she said. "Yuet ha." He wrote it. He wrote it badly, the letters big and dug into the paper like fence posts, and he stopped twice to ask her which sound came next, and she came and stood at his shoulder with the baby and told him, and where the ink went wrong he did not scratch it out. He made it right underneath and let the wrong version stand, so that the page showed the work of getting to her. Under. Name of child. He had already written, in the same rough hand, the 2 names she had given the boy on the 3rd morning, the one for the family register in Sun Wee that might never see him, and the one the camp would use. Then he moved the nib to the blank column, and in it he put, Amos Teague, minor, Bear River Ditch. Below that, in the narrow line the county had left for remarks, "I was outside the door. I heard him come. This is mine." He signed it. He set the pen down and pushed the book back across the table with the flat of his hand. Craig looked at the page for a while without touching it. Then he took up the sand shaker and dusted the wet ink very carefully and blew the sand off into his palm and closed the register. "Monday," he said. "This goes in the vault at Auburn, and a copy of that line goes on the desk of a man at the assay office who has been asking about your water rights since August." Saw Lin did not move away from the counter. Above the register the lamp hissed and shrank, and the room smelled of wet wool and ink and the iron cold that came up through the floorboards of every building in Rough and Ready Bar that winter. "What has water to do with my son?" she said. She set the words down one at a time, the way she set eggs into a basket. Craig turned the sand shaker in his fingers. He was not a cruel man in the way the shift boss at the stamp mill was cruel, with his boots and his voice. Craig was cruel the way a ledger is cruel, by leaving a line empty and letting the emptiness do the work. "A man with no family is a man passing through," he said. "A claim held by a man passing through is a claim the county can be talked into calling abandoned, come spring, when the water's worth more than the gravel. That's been the argument since August." It was a good argument. He tapped the closed cover. "Now there's a boy in the book with your name on him, Mr. Hale, and a mother who can be called into a courtroom, and 30 years of a nuisance somebody has to buy out instead of wait out." Amos Hale stood with his hat in both hands, the brim gone soft with sleet. His knuckles were split across the backs, as they were every February, and there was quartz dust ground so far into the creases of his palm that soap had stopped reaching it years ago. "Then let him be a nuisance," Amos said. Solin took a coin from the knot in her sash and laid it on the register cover. "A copy," she said. "For me. I will pay the fee. Fee's 25 cents. Copies go to the principals. I am the mother." She let the silence sit. She had learned that silence in this country was a tool and not a surrender, that men filled it themselves if she waited, and that what they put into it was usually the truth. "Write it," she said, "and I will come Monday." Craig wrote her a receipt in a hand as neat as embroidery, and he wrote her name on it correctly, Lam Sao Lin, which no one in the camp had ever done on paper before, and she folded it into the inner pocket she had sewn under her jacket for exactly such things, and she carried it out into the weather like a coal in her hand. The street was 3 inches of churned red mud with sleet standing in the ruts. The mercantile had its card in the window, the one that said terms cash, no credit to transients, which had been put up for her without her name on it, and which everyone in the camp understood perfectly. Ah Po was waiting under the awning with her basket over her arm, 71 years old, 4 teeth, the only other woman in the district who spoke to Sa Lin in a language that fit her mouth, and she looked at Sa Lin's face, and then at Amos's, and asked nothing, and fell in beside them for the 2-mile walk up the ditch. The boy slept against Sa Lin's chest in the sling, his fist against her collarbone. In the register he was Isaac Hale, born January the 11th, 1873. In the cabin he was Ah Yuen, little round one, and she had already noticed that he woke when the water in the ditch changed its sound. They heard the men before they saw them. A chain being dragged over frozen brush makes a noise like a snake in dry leaves. 2 of them were at the head of the ditch where the flume took off from Cold Spring Creek, one holding a striped rod, the other kneeling in the sleet over a notebook, and a third figure on the bank with a paper and a hammer. And by the time Sa Lin came up to the head gate, the paper was nailed to it, and the ink was already crawling down the wet plank in gray threads. The surveyors did not speak to her. One of them looked at her, and then at the sling, and then away, and made a note. She stood at the head gate and read the paper aloud, slowly, the way she had taught herself to read from the Mission Bible, and the mercantile's price lists, and the labels on Amos's blasting powder. Notice of intent, diversion, prior appropriation, and then a phrase she stopped on and turned over twice. Continuous beneficial use, she said. Amos, what is beneficial? Useful, he said, means you gotta actually use the water, or you lose the right to it. They'll claim the ditch sat dry. How do they claim it? They'll say it. And there's nobody to say different, because who writes down water? Sa Lin looked at him for a moment in the sleet, and then she laughed, one short sound, the first laugh out of her since the fever week, and Ah Po made a low noise of understanding beside her because Ah Po already knew what was in the box under the bed. In the cabin she built the fire up until the room smelled of pitch, and she laid the boy in the crate cradle, and she pulled out the flat wooden box her mother had packed in Sun Wee, and lifted out the water book. It was not a diary. It was the thing her grandfather had kept for the village and his father before him, the record of the rotation, whose paddy took the ditch on which day and for how long, because in a village of 11 families and 1 channel of water, the book was the piece. She had copied his hand since she was 9 years old. She had begun a new one in April of her first year on this mountain, because she did not know how to live without a book to keep, so she kept the mountain the way her grandfather had kept the water. The day the first snow shut the wagon road above Dutch Flat, and the day the road opened, the hour the flume froze, and the hour it ran again, brown with grit. The price of flour at Vinter's store in October and the price in March, and the difference between them written out plain so that no man could tell her later that she had misremembered. The names of the men who ate at her table under the canvas at the tunnel mouth, and what they paid, and what they still owed, and which of them had a mother in Cornwall, and which had nobody at all. She wrote in columns, right to left, in the small upright hand her grandfather had corrected, with a bamboo switch laid flat against her knuckles, and she ground her ink on the stone he had given her when she left, a stone the size of her palm, wrapped in oilcloth, the only thing she had carried out of Sam Yup that was worth nothing to anyone but her. Her son was born on the 2nd of February, and she wrote that down too. Cao Ching wrote the hour by the sound of the stamp mill, which ran all night and stopped at 4 for the change of shift, and the boy came in the quiet after it stopped, so she wrote, after the mill, before light. She wrote the weather, because her grandfather had always written the weather. Snow, no wind. She wrote the name of the woman who had knelt with her, Bess Truhella, widow of a man the Blue Point Tunnel had kept, who spoke 6 words of Cantonese and had used all 6 of them badly and kindly through the worst of the night. She wrote the weight of him as she guessed it, and she was wrong by ½ a pound, and she left the error uncorrected because a record that hid its mistakes was only a story, and she wrote his name, Lam Chun Lok, for her grandfather, whose ditch book was ash now in a village she would not see again. It was Bess who said that the county wanted him written down as well, that there was a register in Nevada City, in the recorder's office, and a law that said a birth was to be entered, and that a child not entered was a child the county could decide had never been. Cao Qing did not fully understand the word register when Bess said it. She understood the shape of the idea, which was the same shape as the ditch book, a page where a thing became true because it was written and witnessed, and could not afterward be argued away by whoever spoke loudest. Amos Kell borrowed a mule and a wagon from the ditch company and drove them down in the first week of April, the boy in a sling of her own weaving against her chest, the inkstone in her sleeve because she did not like to leave it in the cabin. Kell said almost nothing for 11 miles. He was a man who had spent 9 years underground on his own claim on Shirttail Creek and had learned to spend words the way he spent candles. The clerk's name was Purvis. He had a green shade over his eyes and a register the size of a door, and he did not look up when they came in. "Mother," he said. "Lam Cao Qing," she said. "Careful." Each sound set down separately, the way she set down figures. Purvis wrote Mary. She saw it happen upside down across the desk. 4 letters where there should have been 3 words, and no pause in his wrist at all, as though her name were a thing he had already decided years ago on behalf of every woman who would ever stand where she was standing. "Father," Purvis said. "Amos Kell." Kell said it once, evenly. The pen stopped. Purvis looked up then, at Kell, and at her, and at the boy asleep with his fist against her collarbone, and something moved across his face that was not anger. Anger, she could have answered. This was the small, tired patience of a man declining to lift a weight he had never intended to carry. "I can enter the mother," he said. "Chinese, female, Mary. I can enter the birth as occurred. I'm not entering that." He set the nib down, dry. "There's no line for it. You want the truth of the matter? There's no line for the child either. I'll show the birth and leave it blank. That's the cleanest way, and it does him no harm." "Blank," Cao Qing said. "Blank," Purvis said, and turned the register a quarter turn as though the blankness were a courtesy he was letting her inspect. She looked at the page. She had spent her childhood inside pages like that one. She knew what a blank line did in a book of record. Better than the man who had drawn it. 11 families and 1 channel of water, and the year her uncle's turn went unwritten, and the summer of shouting that followed, and how there was no way afterward to prove a thing that the book had not troubled to hold. Kell took the pen. He did it without hurry, the way he took a drill or a fuse, and he turned the register the rest of the way around, and he dipped, and he wrote in a laborer's hand that leaned and dug, "Samuel Chunlock Kell." Then he crossed out Mary with 1 clean line and wrote Lam Cao Qing above it. Then he signed the father's line, all of it, his full name and the date, and set the pen in its rest. Purvis watched the ink shine. "You understand," he said quietly. "That's an affidavit." She wrote the word down that night as letters, shapes copied from the air, because she did not yet know what it meant. She wrote it 11 times before the fire went low. Affidavit. The double letters like 2 men standing back to back, the tail of the last stroke dragging past the line she had ruled with a splinter of shingle. Her father's inkstone lay open beside the lamp, the small black pool of it no bigger than a coin, and she ground a fresh bead from the stick and dipped the broken brush and made the shapes again, slower, until the letters stopped looking like a fence and began to look like a word. She did not know what she had copied. She knew the sound of it in Purvis's mouth, flat, careful, the way a man says the name of a tool that can cut him. The boy slept in the hollow she had made of 2 flour sacks, 1 fist against his cheek, Saulok. She had given him the middle syllable of her own name so that he would carry her line as well as Kell's, and she had written it in her book weeks before any clerk asked her anything, in ink, in her own hand, on the page where she kept the words she was learning. Now it stood in the county register too, in a white man's writing, under a crossed-out Mary. Outside, the flume ran all night behind the tents, and the snow above the diggings let go of itself in long, soft slides she had learned not to fear. In the morning she carried her tub down to the ditch and found Ah Hoy there with his vegetable poles, resting the load on the stones the way he did when his shoulder ached. He had swept floors in a lawyer's office in Stockton for 2 winters, and came out of it with a limp and a vocabulary. She showed him the page from her book and asked what she had written. He read it. He set his poles down properly, which he did not do for small news. "It means he swore it," Ah Hoy said. "Not just wrote, swore. If it is false, they can take him for it. Fine, jail, the paper torn up and his name in it as a liar." He looked at her, and then at the tent where the child was, and then at the ditch water. "In this state our word is nothing in their court. A Chinese man cannot speak against a white man there, not for a beating, not for a theft, not for anything. He shrugged, an old shrug, worn smooth. So your son's name could not stand on your voice. It had to stand on his. She rinsed the same shirt 3 times without seeing it. Kell came down at noon with his boots wet to the knee and the smell of blasted rock on his coat, and stood at the flap of the wash tent while the steam went past him into the cold. She had rehearsed the sentence while she wrung sheets. She had made it short, because short sentences did not fall apart. "You swore," she said, "for my son. If it is false, they hurt you." "It isn't false. You did not ask me." He turned his hat once in his hands. "No." "Then ask me now." He looked up. There was a long moment where the flat iron ticked on the stove and neither of them helped the other. "Sao Ching," he said, and he said it correctly, the way he had been practicing at the face of the drift where nobody could hear him fail. "Will you let the boy have my name?" "He has mine also," she said. "Both." "Written both." "Both," Kell agreed. She nodded once and went back to the sheets, and he stood there a while longer, and neither of them called it anything. The camp took 8 days to decide what it thought. Duffy at the dry goods weighed her flour, and then set the scoop down and said the barrel was promised. The barrel was in plain sight, half full, the promise unnamed. At the butcher's, the boy behind the block would not take her coin from her hand. He made her lay it on the wood and slid it off with a knife. The assayer's wife, who had once sent her a bundle of mending with a note pinned to it, sent no more bundles. In the tent row where the drift crew boarded, 2 men who had eaten her ginger and pork for a year now paid a nickel more to eat cold beans at Rooney's, because Rooney had said something in the street about a register and a mongrel line, and men will pay for the comfort of agreeing. She raised her prices by nothing and shortened her sentences by nothing and kept the book. Words came in: promised, affidavit, recorder, objection. On the 9th day the snow came down heavy and wet and the flume choked, and Purvis walked up through it in town shoes, holding his coat closed with one hand and a folded paper with the other. He did not step inside. He held the paper out where the wet could not reach it, and his face had the apology of a man delivering something he had helped write. "The recorder at the county seat has questions about the entry," he said. "There's a party in Sacramento raising an objection to it, says he holds paper on you older than any of this." She took the fold and opened it, and there, under all the English she could not yet read, was one name printed clean. She knew that name. She had not spoken it aloud in 2 years. Lo Sai Tin. The letters stood square in the middle of all that dense English, unbothered, the way a boulder sits in a creek while the water works around it. Names crossed the ocean unchanged. Whatever else the page said about her, and it said a great deal, in long lines of ink that ran together like fence wire, it said his name in the same 6 shapes that had been painted on the door of the office on I Street in Sacramento, gold on red, and brushed also on the receipt he had given the man who brought her down from the ship, a receipt she had watched change hands over her own head as though she were a crate of dried scallops. She set the fold flat on the plank table and smoothed it once with the heel of her hand, because her hands wanted something to do. Ovid stayed by the door with his hat off, the way men did in her cookhouse when they wanted to be thought decent. He was the timekeeper at the Blue Point Drift, and he wrote a careful hand, and it had been his careful hand that entered her son in the county register last spring, while Amos Kell stood at the counter with rock dust still in the creases of his neck. The clerk in Auburn had left the father's line empty and had said the word. Illegitimate. Twice, slowly, as if slowness would make it kinder, Amos had reached across, taken the pen out of the inkwell, and signed the line himself. Ovid had blotted it. 3 men had watched. That was February a year ago, and the ink had dried, and she had believed, foolishly, that dried ink was the same as a settled thing. "They want somebody to come down and answer it," Ovid said. "Him or you. Preferably him, is my read, but the objection names you." "When?" she said. "Hearing set the 29th. That's 11 days. 11, she repeated, and turned the word over, and found it whole. In her first winter here, she had counted in her own language and translated afterward, always a half-second behind the men, always guessing. Now the numbers came in English first and cost her nothing. She had measured her progress by such small thefts. Outside, the thaw was working. Water ran under the snow along the flume road with a sound like something breathing in its sleep, and the peaks above Iowa Hill had gone the flat blue they went before more weather. She had learned to read that color the way she had once read her father's face when a patient's pulse ran thin. Snow coming, 3 days out, maybe 4. The road to the county seat would be mud to the axle by the 29th, and mud was a thing that could be argued with. Lo-Sai tin was not. She put the kettle over the coals because 22 men would want their dinner whether or not a party in Sacramento held paper on her, and while the water came up, she went to the shelf above the flour barrel and took down the indigo cloth. Inside it lay the little brass balance from her father's shop in Sunwee, the pans no bigger than halved plums, the beam worn bright in the middle where 4 generations of thumbs had lifted it. She did not weigh anything. She only held it and let the cool of the brass go up through her wrist, and thought of the back room in Canton where a man in a gray silk jacket had explained, kindly, patiently, in her own dialect, with tea poured for her and everything, exactly what she would be signing and exactly how quickly it would be paid off. He had lied in her own language. That was the part she had never been able to explain to anyone here. The lie had come to her in the words her mother sang to her in, and it had been beautiful, and she had believed it because it was beautiful. Her son woke in the crate bed by the stove and made the small creaking noise he made instead of crying, and she went and lifted him, and he took hold of her ear as he always did. "Ah Yin," she said against his hair. "Magoy, Magoy, wait one moment." In the register in Auburn he was written. Yin Kell, male child, born at Blue Point Camp. And under father, in a hand that pressed too hard on the downstrokes, Amos Kell. Amos came in at dusk with the shift, smelling of powder smoke and wet wool, and he saw the fold on the table and Ovit's boot prints drying on the floor, and he did not ask a single question until he had washed to the elbow and sat down. Then he said, "Who is he?" "A man who sold me," she said. Amos looked at the paper a long time. He read slowly, mouthing nothing, the way a man reads an essay he does not like. It says he's owed. It says the child follows the debt. He set his hand flat over the words as if to keep them from getting out. That's not law. That's a man in a good coat hoping nobody in Auburn knows the difference. He knows the difference, she said. He has bought the difference before. The fire ticked. Ah Yin gnawed a wooden spoon. Then we go down and we say your name and my name, and we make them write it, Amos said. What's on that paper of his that I don't know? She looked at the brass pans on the shelf and at the snow coming and did not answer him yet, because the contract he had shown her in that back room in Canton had carried 2 thumbprints at the bottom, pressed in the same red paste, one of them her own, and the other belonging to a girl of 11 who had been promised the same beautiful thing. The stove had burned down to embers behind her, and the cold came under the door in a thin, steady blade that found her ankles through 2 pairs of stockings. Outside, the wind had changed direction sometime in the last hour. She had heard it turn the way she used to hear the tide turn in the creek below her village, a small alteration in the world that only people who worked outdoors ever noticed. Snow before morning. Snow, and then the road down to Dutch Flat gone for a month, maybe 2. She took down the smaller of the brass pans, though she had nothing to weigh, and set it on the plank table because her hands wanted something to hold. 2 names, she said. Elias Boyd did not move from the doorframe. He had a way of waiting that she had learned to read as patience rather than threat, and it had taken her 4 months to learn the difference. On his paper, she said, 2 names, mine is one. And the other? She went to the crate under her cot and lifted out the tin that had once held English biscuits and now held everything she had carried across the water. A bone comb with 3 teeth gone, a packet of dried tangerine peel, gone black, saved past all use because her mother's hands had folded the paper, and a seal, stone, the size of a thumb joint, her family name cut into the base in characters her father had chosen when she was born, and beside it a hard little cake of cinnabar paste, dried down to nearly nothing. She set the seal on the table beside the brass pan and did not explain it, and he did not ask. In Canton, she said, there was a room behind a shop, rice merchant in front, in back a table, a lamp, and the agent, Lou Sam. He read the paper to us out loud, because he knew, she paused, arranging the English carefully, the way she arranged bones in a soup pot, largest first, because he believed we could not read. I could read, I did not say. What did it say? Passage money, $140, gold, a husband at the end of the line, land, a house with a floor of wood. She let a breath out through her nose. It said beautiful things. Then at the bottom, the place for the thumb. She held her right thumb up to the lamp as though the red paste might still be there. 6,000 miles and 2 winters later. Mine, she said. And under mine, one more. A girl. 11 years. The wind pushed at the stovepipe and the embers brightened, then dimmed. 11, he said. Ngan. From the next village, 1 hour walking. Her father was dead in the water in the 3rd month. Lu Sam paid the rice debt of her mother, and she pressed her thumb, and he told her the same beautiful thing he told me. She turned the brass pan a quarter turn on the plank so its rim caught the light. 1 paper, 2 thumbs, 1 price against the other. He came off the doorframe then and sat down on the upturned crate across from her, elbows on his knees, hat still on, and she saw him work it through the way he worked through a bad seam of rock, slowly, from the outside in. You mean if you don't pay, he said, he takes it out of her? I mean he wrote it so that it can be either of us. He does not need to say it, it is on the paper. Both thumbs, 1 debt. Where is she now? Sacramento, a house on the alley behind the fish market. She said it flatly, because there was no gentle way to lay it in front of him, and because pity was a thing she could not afford to be given in this room while the snow was coming. 2 years, she is 13, I have sent money 4 times. Twice it came back, once it did not come back, and I do not know which is worse. Boyd took his hat off. He turned it in his hands, that battered thing with the sweat line dark across the crown, and she watched him look at the floor of her cook shed, at her cot, her herb shelf, the 3 jars of pickled mustard greens, the boiling pot she scoured every night with river sand until it shone like something in a temple. That's why you took the boarding work, he said. Not the debt. Her. Both. But her first. The men in the camp called her China Mary, all of them, and had from the first week, because it cost them nothing, and because they had never once considered that she had been given a name at an hour chosen by an astrologer, with a chicken killed for it. Boyd had asked, on the 4th day, standing in the steam of her cook shed with his hands full of somebody else's laundry. What do they call you at home? She had told him. He had said it back wrong, and then right, and then said nothing else about it for a month, and that silence had been the first kindness she had received on this mountain. Lu Sam is coming up, she said, with the last wagon, before the pass shuts. Sing Ki told me Tuesday, to collect, to count. She pressed her palm flat against the low curve of her belly, where the child had turned sometime near dawn and had been still since. And the county man rides with him, to write the dead in his book and the born. Boyd looked up at her. He will not write this one, she said. You know it, I know it, then we'll see about that. She almost smiled, and did not, because there was a word for what a man says before he understands the shape of the thing he is promising, and she had no English for it, so she gave it to him in her own. Ho Sam, she said, good heart. That is not the same as strong hand. Boyd did not argue with her that night. He went out and split kindling in the dark until the pile was twice what the stove needed, and saw Lin listen to the axe from inside the tent, and understood that a man who could not answer a thing with words would answer it with his hands, which was its own kind of promise and its own kind of danger. They went down on Thursday, the 11th of October, in a borrowed wagon with a wheel that sang on every 3rd turn. The boy rode against her chest in a wide band of indigo cloth, tied the way her mother had tied her brothers, his head heavy in the crook of her collarbone, his breath damp through her jacket. The road ran past the diggings at Gold Run, where the water cannons hissed all day into the gravel banks, tearing the hills down into red slurry, and the creek below ran the color of weak blood all the way to the Bear. Men crouched in the tailings with rockers, working what the company had already thrown away. One of them straightened as the wagon passed, and looked at the bundle on her chest, and lifted his chin, and she lifted hers, and nothing else needed saying between 2 people who had come over the same water. Auburn smelled of oak smoke and horse and the hot iron of a smithy. The Hall of Records had green shutters and a plank floor waxed pale in the middle where 40 years of boots had walked the same 6 feet, and the stove was not lit though the morning had frost in it. Behind the counter, on a slant desk, lay the register, leather, marbled edges, ruled in 11 columns, the ink of other people's children drying in it since spring. The clerk's name was Amos Purvis. Sleeve garters, 1 cuff blue at the wrist from the pen, spectacles pushed up so he could look at Boyd over them instead of through them. Morning, recording? A birth, Boyd said. Purvis looked at her then, at the cloth, at the black hair flattened by the wind, and he spoke over her head the way men in that country had been speaking over her head for 2 years. Whose is it? Mine, Boyd said. The word came out flat and unhurried, the way he said. Hoist. Or. Thaw. Or. Hold. And it sat in the cold room with nowhere to go. Purvis pulled the spectacles down at last, dipped the pen, and began the way clerks begin, from the left. Number of entry, 409. Date of birth, the 10th of November. Sex, male. Place, Blue Fork, Placer County. His hand was neat. He had a clerk's pride in his loops. Then the pen came to the 7th column, where the ruled line said, Name of father. And it stopped, and lifted, and hovered over the paper the way a hand hovers over a stove to test it. Marriage recorded in this county? He said. No. Elsewhere? There's a paper, Boyd said, written in Chinese. Purvis set the pen in the groove of the desk. Then I'll take the particulars on a memorandum slip and hold them for the recorder's judgment. The registers for lawful issue of county residence. He said it kindly, almost. He said it the way a man reads a posted schedule aloud to somebody who cannot read. There's no line for this. She had been standing near the door with the child inside her coat, and she felt the room shift. That old shift she knew from the wharf at San Francisco, and the tent at Cisco, and the counter at the Mercantile, where the scale had been weighted on her side of the beam. Being spoken about, being disposed of in the third person while she stood 4 feet away with the evidence warm against her ribs. Boyd looked down at the register. The 7th column was empty, and the 8th, and the 9th, and the whole right half of the page lay white as a snowfield with only the child's date of birth stranded on it like a track going nowhere. He reached over the counter and took the pen. That's a county book, Purvis said. It is. Boyd shook the nib once, and bent, and wrote his name whole into the 7th column, all 3 of it, the middle name he never used, the one his mother had taken out of a Bible in Ohio and given him with nothing else. He wrote it slowly because he had a blaster's hands and they had never been good at small things, and the letters came out square and hard-pressed and legible for 100 years. Under. Occupation of father. He wrote. Minor. Under. Nativity of father. Next. Ohio. Then he set the pen down in front of her. She came to the counter. She had rehearsed her sentence on the road down, 3 miles of frost-slicked switchbacks, and she gave it to him now in English, carefully, each word laid down separate like coins onto cloth. My son was born at 2 in the morning, the 10th of November. I am his mother. This man is his father. She paused. My district is Sun Wei, in Kwangtung. Purvis wrote. China. In the 11th column, because that was all the county had ever wanted to know about anybody who came from there, she took the pen. She wrote her name in the 10th column in her own hand, in her own characters, 3 of them, brushed small and upright with a steel nib that had never carried a stroke like that before. Her surname first, the way a name ought to stand, family before self. Then, beneath it, because the county could not read what she had written, she printed it a second time in English letters. She had learned the letters that winter from a page of a Sacramento newspaper pasted over a knothole. The printing was slow and it leaned, and it was hers. For the child she gave 2 names and told Purvis to write both, the register name and the name that belonged in the family book, the one for the ancestors, who would want to know where he had come out into the air, and at what hour, and to whom. Purvis's pen hesitated at the syllables. She said them again. He got them down. Boyd blotted the page with the county blotter and turned the register back around, and the 11 columns were full from edge to edge, and no line on it was blank. You've made me trouble, Purvis said. I've made you a record. The trouble came, as it does in that country, by mail. Purvis wrote to the recorder at Auburn and laid the case out fairly enough, and the reply came back in January in a copperplate hand from a man who had never been up the grade. An entry once made in the Register of Births could be struck only by order of the court, and no order was applied for, because no one wanted to stand up in a courtroom in Auburn and explain what harm had been done by a minor claiming his own son. The line held. Bureaucracy, which had spent 2 years telling her what she was not, kept her by its own rules. The town took longer. Kellum at the Mercantile still weighed her flour with his thumb on the pan until she began buying through the Chinese firm at Dutch Flat and had her rice and her ginger and her needles hauled up by wagon at a saving of 11 cents on the dollar, which she wrote in her own ledger in her own columns. The church wives crossed to the other side of the street through Lent. The assayer went on calling her. The woman up at Boyd's. In February, Purvis came up the grade himself, hatless, with his youngest girl wrapped in 2 coats and burning through both of them. He did not take off his gloves, and he did not say please. She let him in, set the kettle, and worked until the child's breath came loose and easy sometime near dawn. He left silver on the table. She pushed it back across the wood and asked instead that he say her name, the whole of it, the one her father had brushed on the back of her contract, before he went down the grade. He said it badly. He said it. After that they came, one and two at a time, up the path past the sluice, the brakeman's wife, the powder man with the cough that would not clear, Kellam's own mother in October. The ledger filled in her own columns. Her English grew until she no longer waited for Boyd to speak first, and the boy learned both tongues at once, singing the wrong one at the wrong hour, and never once corrected for it. The certificate hung by the door in a frame Boyd cut from snow-shed pine, his name standing in the blank the clerk had left, the ink gone brown as steeped tea. Below it, on the sill, her mother's brass scale, one pan for herbs, one for gold, hung level in the mountain light.